In the Bible, there were many great leaders and prophets, but few have had the same impact as the biblical figure Moses. Born into a world of slavery and oppression, he rose to become a great reformer. But how did he become such a significant figure? What challenges did he face? And what can we learn from his life? This video will explore Moses' life and the lessons we can take away from his remarkable journey. Before exploring the early life of Moses, we must briefly revisit the Israelites' history into the land of Egypt and how they found themselves in the land of the Egyptians for better context. In the book of Genesis, the Bible recorded that there was a great famine in the land, and God used a Hebrew man named Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, to liberate the land of Egypt. The Israelites then established themselves in Egypt, and in a show of gratitude for what Joseph did for them, the Egyptians accepted the people of Israel and treated them with respect. But long after Joseph's death, the lives of the Hebrews in Egypt started to change. God made Abraham's descendants to become numerous, and the Hebrew population in Egypt proliferated. They began to gain strength in numbers and influence in Egyptian affairs. When a new pharaoh sat on the throne, one who knew nothing about Joseph and was oblivious to the debt of gratitude Egypt owed to the people of Israel, the lives of the Hebrews changed drastically. Noticing the rapid growth of the Hebrew population and their thriving nature as blessed people of God, the pharaoh feared that if the growth of the Israelites wasn't contained, they could pose a massive threat to the Egyptians. The Israelites were subjected to slavery and were forced to undergo degrading and complex tasks. Nonetheless, the people of Israel continued to multiply just as God promised Abraham. Pharaoh then ordered the midwives of the Israelites to kill the Hebrew offspring as soon as they were born, but they refused to obey such an order. Instead, when questioned about their decision to disobey, they stated that the Hebrew women were blessed with such strength that their babies were born before the arrival of the midwives. That angered Pharaoh, and in his rage, he made a decree that every newborn male child be executed and thrown into the Nile, and that only the females be saved. Terror grew among the Israelites as the Hebrew women witnessed their babies snatched from them and executed in cold blood. A woman of the tribe of Levi attempted to hide her son. She was successful for 3 months as she managed to dodge the Pharaoh's wrath. But as the baby grew older, it became more challenging to keep the baby hidden. Desperate to save her son's life, she put the baby in a basket, covered him with a seagrass blanket, and let him sail the Nile while she prayed to God for mercy, guidance, and protection for her son and to deliver him from his fate. God listened to the Levi woman's prayers and guided the basket towards the riverbank, where Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. She spotted the floating basket and ordered her maid to retrieve it from the water. To her greatest surprise, she found a beautiful baby boy inside. Not minding that the child was a Hebrew offspring, she adopted him and named him Moses. Moses grew and was among the highest Egyptian nobility and was treated as royalty. The Egyptian princess needed a nurse for the baby, and to feed Moses, a Hebrew slave woman was brought, and as the will of God would have it, it was none other than his biological mother. Among the princes of Egypt, Moses lived a life of luxury and privilege throughout his childhood, but he couldn't help but feel an emptiness inside. As an adult, he couldn't help himself anymore. It was as if something kept drawing him to his roots. He wanted to see how the Hebrews were treated. Upon witnessing the conditions in which his people were living, Moses was heartbroken. In the book of Exodus chapter 2, it states that Moses witnessed an Egyptian soldier brutally assault a fellow Jew, and he let his anger get the best of him. In a fit of rage, he pounced on the Egyptian soldier and ended up killing him. The news of Moses' dreadful crime quickly spread, and it came to the attention of the Pharaoh, who then ordered Moses' arrest. Having no other option, Moses had to flee from the land. As he was running, he came across a group of females trying to hydrate their flock, but a group of shepherds were stopping them from reaching the well. So Moses intervened on behalf of the women and allowed them to give water to their animals. The girls thanked Moses, invited him back home, and introduced him to their father, telling him about what he did for them. In a show of gratitude, the girls' father invited Moses to live with them and even offered one of his daughters to him in marriage, and Moses settled in the Middle Midland. He and his wife Zipporah gave birth to a son and lived peacefully in their new home. But while Moses was busy settling down in a foreign land, the Israelites continued to suffer at the hands of the Egyptians, especially after introducing a new pharaoh who was even more challenging to them than his successors. The people of God cried out for help, and the Lord answered their prayers. He appeared to Moses in the form of a burning bush on the Mount Horeb, and he guided his flock as they grazed. Moses noticed the bush burning at the top of the mountain, but the flames didn't consume it. Intrigued by this mysterious occurrence, Moses approached the burning bush and heard the voice of the Lord. The Lord declared that he had heard his people's cries and had come to intervene, and Moses would be the instrument he used to deliver his people from the hands of the Egyptians. Initially, Moses didn't buy into the idea. He was just a simple man. He couldn't imagine himself leading an entire nation out of slavery. But the voice of the Lord commanded him to drop his staff, and it turned into a serpent. Moses was surprised, but he wasn't afraid after witnessing a talking burning bush that didn't seem to be the most unusual thing he came across that day. The Lord also commanded him to take the snake by its tail, and he didn't disobey. As soon as he grabbed it, it turned back into his staff. That miracle alone was enough to convince Moses and show that God was with them and that he had come to liberate them. But Moses still felt that he wasn't up to the task and wasn't fluent in speaking, as Moses was known to have a stutter. But the Lord assured Moses that he will always be with him. Moses, with the help of his brother Aaron, was able to convince the Israelites that the former prince of Egypt was, in fact, their God-sent liberator. They accepted him as one of their own, but the Pharaoh wasn't as easily convinced. Moses and Aaron were able to score an audience with Pharaoh, and they relayed God's will to him. They ordered the Pharaoh to free people of God, but he proved stubborn. Moses dropped his staff and was transformed into a serpent, and the Pharaoh ordered his priests to do the same, and with the help of their dark magic, they could transform their staff into snakes too. However, Moses' snake swallowed the two snakes that the priest had conjured up. Moses picked up his snake, and it turned back into his staff. Before he made his exit, he urged the Pharaoh to once again let his people go, or else Egypt would feel the wrath of God. Such a threat only angered the Pharaoh, and in retaliation, he made the lives of the Israelites even more difficult. The Lord ordered Moses to return to Pharaoh and demand the release of his people, knowing fully well that the Pharaoh would still be stubborn. So Moses returned to Pharaoh and demanded the release of his people. As the Pharaoh refused again, different calamities plagued the land of Egypt. These events will later be known as the 10 plagues of Egypt. The 10 plagues were water turning into blood, plagues of frogs, lice and gnats, flies, pestilence among livestock, boils, hail and fire, locusts, darkness, death of the firstborn sons. As the Bible records, the Israelites had been under the Egyptian government for 400 years before Moses' time. All efforts to free them seemed useless, as the Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he wasn't willing to bend to God's will as Moses commanded. At the time, freeing the Israelites seemed like an impossible task. But God was with Moses and Aaron, and they would be instruments that God used to fulfill the promises he made to Abraham and his descendants. God instructed Moses to meet the Pharaoh again. This time, he was navigating the Nile in a royal vessel when Moses interrupted him, asking once again to free the people of God. But Pharaoh refused, so Moses took his staff and stabbed the river, and it became as red as blood. All the creatures of the water died. A foul odor took over its banks, and the water became unfit. However, Pharaoh wasn't still moved by what Moses had done. Although the Egyptians had to drill wells to quench their thirst, they still used Hebrew enslaved people to carry out those tasks. That was the first plague. Pharaoh was still unwilling to listen to Moses, so God struck Egypt with another plague. He causes countless birds to emerge from the Nile and invade Egypt. Every Egyptian home was filled with frogs, toads, and all sorts of amphibians. Not the palace was safe. Even the bed of the Pharaoh was swarmed with frogs. Pharaoh then told Moses that he would free the Israelites if he made the frogs disappear. So Moses got rid of the frogs, and when the plague was over, the Pharaoh decided to withdraw his initial statement and didn't keep to his word. God then caused the earth to bring out lice that infected the people and animals in Egypt. Clouds of flies covered the whole of Egypt, but the places where the Hebrews lived were free of these plagues. Pharaoh still proved stubborn, so God caused a sickness to fall on Egypt, one that killed every animal and livestock that belonged to the Egyptians. Pharaoh's priests couldn't replicate these features and acknowledged that it could only be a higher God backing Moses and his people. But the Pharaoh refused to listen to his advisors. More calamities continued to befall Egypt as a result of the stubbornness of the Pharaoh. Heavy rain and lightning roared throughout the land, and people who didn't take cover were either swept away by the rain or struck dead by the lightning from the clouds. The swarm of locusts was the 8th plague that came to Egypt, and colonies of locusts destroyed everything that was in their paths. Pharaoh sensed that his stubbornness was leading to the destruction of Egypt, but his pride wouldn't let him bend to the will of Moses and the Lord God who sent him. Egypt was now the victim of a total eclipse. For 3 days, they lived in pure darkness. This was the 9th plague. But the Lord was far from done with Egypt. He told Moses that he was about to be the most dreadful plague yet. He was going to unleash the spirit of death on Egypt. He stated that he would go to Egypt at midnight and claim the lives of all the firstborn sons of Egypt. No Egyptian household was spared, but the people of Israel were unharmed. Moses, according to the will of God, had instructed the Israelites to make sacrifices to God and use the blood of the sacrificed animals to mark the doors to the entrance of their houses, so that when the Spirit of the Lord is moving through Egypt at midnight, he will pass over any door that has been marked with the blood of an animal. At midnight, God sent the angel of death to Egypt, who went from door to door, claiming the lives of the firstborn sons, sparing only the houses that were marked entranced with blood. Pharaoh's son and heir to his throne was among those who died, and his unrelenting will was broken. He finally gave in to Moses' request, ordering him and his people to leave Egypt. The people of Israel were free, and through Moses, God led them out of Egypt to the land that he promised their ancestors. After enduring 430 years of slavery, the Lord came to the aid of his people. After imposing 10 terrible plagues on Egypt, Moses finally got the Pharaoh to free the Israelites. Under the leadership of Moses, who was led by God and assisted by Aaron, hundreds of thousands of Hebrews took their belongings and marched on to the Promised Land. The large colonies of Israelites headed through the desert because after the death of the Pharaoh's son, they feared that he wouldn't let them go as quickly as he did, and they were proper. Pharaoh prepared armies and chariots and began pursuit of the people he had just let go. God instructed Moses to guide them to the shores of the Red Sea. The Israelites were stricken with fear, and some thought surrendering and returning to their masters would be the wiser option. In contrast, others blamed Moses and accused him of bringing them out there to die, but Moses assured them that God was at their side and that he would not forsake them, even now that they needed him most. The people of Israel could see the Egyptian armies from afar, and the Pharaoh and his soldiers were approaching quickly. Then God instructed Moses to go to the shores of the Red Sea and raise his staff, and he parted with the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to walk on dry land. This act alone removed every doubt from the minds of the Israelites, reassuring them that God was still on their side. Pharaoh and his armies continued their pursuit and were hot on the trail of the Israelites. They even followed the dry path that Moses had made through the Red Sea. But as soon as the last Hebrew had reached the other side, the Lord commanded Moses to raise his staff and close the Red Sea. So Moses closed the Red Sea on the Egyptian armies and drowned every last one of them. The Israelites sang praises to God and celebrated Moses. They were finally free of their Egyptian oppressors. The Ten Commandments. For days, the people of Israel wandered through the desert and were getting tired and hungry. They began to murmur against the Lord and Moses, saying it would be better to endure the suffering of the Egyptians than to survive under these conditions. But the Lord would not let his people perish. He caused manners to fall from heaven and directed birds' flocks towards their location whenever they needed meat. God took care of his people even in the most unbelievable situations. He kept his promises to their ancestors that they would inherit a land flowing with milk and honey, the Promised Land. They came up to Mount Sinai, camped at the foot of the mountain, and Moses went up to talk with God. Only Moses was allowed to climb the mountain. Any other person would be struck dead if they tried. The Israelites' water supply had run dry, so they complained to Moses, and he prayed to God and was instructed to speak to the rock at Meribah staff, and water would flow. But Moses had grown tired of the constant murmuring of the Israelites, so in anger he struck the stone hard with his staff, and water gushed out with colossal pressure. Because of this, God told Moses that he would not see the promised land he had set aside for his people. Moses went up to the mountain and stayed there for 40 days. The Israelites became uncertain of their fate, so they were afraid and turned their backs on God. The men instructed the women to bring their gold and jewels, and they melted the gold, formed a golden image of a calf, and started worshiping it. God told Moses that his people had turned their backs on him and were corrupting their hearts. While on the mountain, God presented Moses with 2 stone tablets. On it was written a code of conduct that the people of Israel were to live by. This was later known as the Ten Commandments, which read, "You shall not have any other gods besides me. You shall create no idol for yourself, no image of anything in heaven, on earth, or in the waters beneath the earth. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord shall not leave unpunished those who take his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor your father and mother, so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord gives you. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witnesses against your neighbors. You shall not covet your neighbor's house or wife, his servants and maidservants, his ox or donkey, or anything that is his." Moses came down from the mountain to present the Israelites with the 10 Commandments and relay to them the consequences that await those who disobey them. Moses met the Israelites worshiping the idol they had made. It angered Moses that he dropped the tablets, and they broke. Moses destroyed the image and the altar that the Israelites built and killed off the corrupt people, so their corruption wouldn't spread. About 3,000 Israelites were executed that day. The Israelites repented of their ways, and Moses went back to the top of the mountain. God gave him another stone tablet, and he took them back to the Israelites and taught them to follow the commandments of God. A beautiful ark was built to keep the laws delivered to them by God. It was made of wood and covered in gold. Cherub statues adorned the lid, later known as the Ark of the Covenant. The Israelites would still spend another 40 years wandering in the desert before they finally arrived in Canaan, the Promised Land. The Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness mainly because of their lack of faith and obedience. When God first brought them out of Egypt, they were supposed to go straight to the Promised Land. However, when they reached the border of Canaan, they refused to go in because they were afraid of the land's inhabitants. This disobedience led to God's judgment, and he told them they would spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. During this time, all of the people who had left Egypt would die off, and their children would be the ones to inherit the Promised Land. Moses was 120 years old when he died, and God buried him in an unknown grave. Moses didn't make it to the Promised Land. because he disobeyed God's command at the waters of Meribah. Because of this disobedience, God told Moses that he would not lead the people into the promised land. In the story of Moses, the roles of his siblings Miriam and Aaron are often overlooked. They were both instrumental in helping Moses lead the Israelites and were with him from the beginning. Miriam was the one who watched over baby Moses in the basket, and she later prophesied about Moses. Aaron was the one who spoke on Moses' behalf, and he was the first high priest of Israel. Without their support, Moses would not have been able to accomplish all that he did. Seeing how God used a whole family to accomplish his purposes is fascinating. The life of Moses can be summed up as a story of redemption and God's faithfulness. Despite his humble beginnings as a baby in a basket, God used Moses to deliver the Israelites from slavery and to lead them out of Egypt. Moses faced many challenges, including rebellions and the people's stubbornness, but through it all, God was with him and guided him. Moses was a faithful servant of God, and his life inspired us all. Remember to subscribe to our channel. If you found this content valuable, we'll see you in the next one.